Thousands protesting in Venezuela today against President Nicolas Maduro as the U.S. is now officially supporting the new interim president. Trump tweeting this message earlier, quote, "The citizens of Venezuela have suffered for too long at the hands of the illegitimate Maduro regime. Today I have officially recognized the president of the Venezuelan National Assembly, Juan Guaido, as the interim president of Venezuela." Our Trish Regan just sat down with Vice President Mike Pence for an exclusive interview. Here's what he says about the country's new leader. Roll the tape.
3 million Venezuelans have fled their country because of deprivation and oppression and poverty. 2 million more are expected to flee Venezuela in the next year alone. The country is literally a failed state. And what President Guaido represents is a new beginning for the people of Venezuela.
So what lessons have we learned here?
Well, this is an incredibly tough situation where you're literally seeing people for many years now starving on the streets in Venezuela. And people were asking me earlier, is this regime change? This is not any sort of American-led intervention here. What this is the president rightfully standing by the people of Venezuela, for freedom, for the ability at this point just to even eat and feed their children. It's an incredibly dire situation. And if we look back beyond just having a rogue dictator here, for us recognizing his competition, the head of the National Assembly, what's really going on here is a larger geopolitical struggle between the U.S. and China. China gets a lot of their oil from Venezuela. The Chinese hold a lot of Venezuelan debt. So what you're seeing is the Chinese feel that we menace and their Asian region. They want us out of the theater. They're more than happy to have the influence in Venezuela. And they clearly probably do not want to see a leader emerge that's going to be pro-democracy and pro-America whenever they're on the bag for so much Venezuelan debt.
Yes, there is something called the Monroe Doctrine, no interference in the American hemisphere, and we have to start enforcing that, and one way to do it is bring this regime down, cut off their access to banking, cut off their ability even more to sell oil, identify those officers of bank accounts and start seizing them. And by the way, the far left has an apology to make. Let me just read this quote from Bernie Sanders back in 2011. He said, "These days, the American dream is more apt to be realized in South America in places such as Ecuador, Venezuela, and Argentina, where incomes are more equal than they are in the land of the Horatio Alger," that's the U.S. He says, "Who's the banana republic now?" He called the U.S. a banana republic. Look at those street scenes. You going to apologize, Bernie Sanders? I doubt it.
That is a
No,
Bernie
he's not, Steve,
Bond.
but I'll tell you what. Why don't you embargo the oil, though, Steve? This has been something that's been talked about for years.
We've
got a crash in crude prices. Right, and they've got a crash in crude prices, too, to give them that lead block to stay in the Super Bowl theme through the line of scrimmage to say, you know what, embargo their oil. If the crude price rallies a couple more bucks, big deal. We've got our oil game together anyway.
Well, I think if I can just cut in here, one of the reasons why we probably haven't done that, I know that the Treasury, we have sanctioned, and we've looked at a range of options. The underlying issue in all of this is that the Venezuelan military still supports Maduro. Maduro clearly keeps them very fat and happy and paid. So,
but that's how you get them.
Potentially, but you also don't want to exacerbate a human catastrophe. Listen, I'm for very strong. I think what the president did today was incredibly important. In 2009, when the Iranian people stood up against their government, President Obama did not recognize the legitimacy in a forceful way, in a way that President Trump is doing today. So he gets a lot of credit for it. But I do think we have a delicate balance here where you already have millions of Venezuelan refugees that are going into Colombia.
Yes.
Anything that we do here needs to be worked hand in hand with Colombia, with our allies, and with our allies in the region, but especially Colombia, because they're the ones that's going to have to bear the brunt of the human catastrophe.
We know who the officers are, and if we start identifying them, saying we know who you are, you have a chance to get amnesty, you're going to be arrested one way or the other as a war criminal. That's how you start to undermine the military. Go after their soft spots, their corruption.
You asked at the start, what lessons have we learned from Venezuela? The lesson is Venezuela is a failed state. Full stop. Now, what lessons are we going to pretend that we learned? Wait until you begin to hear it. Anytime someone across America wants to so much as expand a school lunch program, my Republican friends are going to say, haven't you been looking at what's going on in Venezuela? Do you want to be the next Venezuela? Folks, it's not an either-or choice. There are more than two choices.
And there's also regional security that has to be dealt with.
Right.
Those 5 million refugees, this mass exodus of Venezuelans who are living in poverty, living in fear. Where do they go? How do they work? They often get involved in crime, whether it's human trafficking, drugs, and that is something that we have to worry about.
Illegal mining is also taking place there. And don't forget terrorism. There were 21 Colombians killed by a far-left terror group that that Maduro protects, that also has safe harbor in Cuba. So we're seeing Venezuela and Cuba, really, at this point, it's state sponsor of terrorism. That's at least what Senator Rubio described today in his
Maduro's response to all of this was to break sanctions with the U.S., to break relations, to break relations. We do still have sanctions on them, and giving U.S. diplomats 72 hours now to leave the country. So what happens now? Do we have the answer to that?
No, we don't. And Lauren, and that's the thing, too. I think that's interesting. That's why you got to do something different going forward, because as Morgan pointed out at the top, I mean, this kind of regime, this kind of attitude from the U.S. alone has allowed things to deteriorate. So you have to change the formula here.
Well, that means giving assistance to the dissidents. We did that in Eastern and Central Europe during the Cold War in the 1980s, especially Solidarity in Poland, reprised that. Go after their bank accounts, cut them off from all the global banking system, the Swiss system. There are various measures you can take. And Colombia, which is getting the brunt of this, would be gladly on our side. I think all of Latin America, they don't want to go the way of Venezuela, and they fear it. Another thing we got to look at is a time, once again, we're going to have to take measures against Cuba, which is the biggest mainstay in terms of security, oppressive security inside Venezuela.
All right, well, more on this issue will be tonight on Trish Regan's show. Well, in the meantime...